Hi, welcome to our next subunit, High Renaissance Painting. In this segment, we're going to be traveling back to Italy. So in our last segment, we had traveled to the northern part of Europe and looked at the Renaissance that was going on there, which was quite different than the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance that we usually think of when we think of Renaissance art. Just to recap, before Christmas, we had been looking at the early Renaissance in Italy in the 1400s. This is sort of where the world was waking up from the medieval period. And the Renaissance really had its start in the city of Florence. And again, this idea of Renaissance or rebirth of culture would eventually spread to Rome and Venice. We will talk about Venice in our next subunit. And then in the 1500s to the rest of Europe, known as the Northern Renaissance. And so we visited places in our last segment, such as the Netherlands, Germany. We didn't really look at anything in France or England, but it was there as well. So here we are. So we were kind of up here in the northern part of Europe, and now we're sort of heading back down here to Italy. So we're going to be, like I said before, backtracking just a bit back into the 16th century to the 1500s. And this is where artistic leadership spreads from Florence to Rome and then eventually Venice. And we start to see these giant sort of superstar artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. And they're creating sculptures and paintings with this incredible technical mastery. Their work fused with Renaissance discoveries, a lot of these were sort of, delving in scientific observation as well, led to compositions that were innovative, ideal proportions, also the use of perspective. Remember linear perspective we talked about when we first started talking about early Renaissance. And this all sort of came together and culminated what is referred to as the High Renaissance, which dates from 1500 to 1520. So the term High Renaissance usually refers to the golden age or the peak of this movement, and we've seen that with high classical art, with Greek art, and so this is sort of the golden sort of moment during this time period. So we're looking at a sketch or one of the pages from the sketchbook of Leonardo da Vinci. So when we think of the term Renaissance man, he really does come to mind and really has become a symbol of that. Leonardo was not only an artist, he was a scientist, he was an inventor, and he was a pretty sort of strange individual. And what you're looking at is a sketch of an embryo, which shows how curious he was about the world. And Leonardo kept these amazing notebooks. He really liked to observe nature, and he studied models. And so he actually would do dissections and use cadavers and really try to learn not just, the outer part of the body, but how the body worked internally as well. He hypothesized how universal principles worked in the human body. He was very interested in the search for universal principles that governed organic life, and that is a theme that you will see prevalent throughout his work. He often wrote in retrograde, which is writing in backwards, in his sketchbook, so he was also a little bit maybe suspicious and paranoid as well. I wanted to backtrack a little bit too, just again, to look at Italy. I also wanted to point out too that individual city-states were still fighting each other and competing with each other at the time. So that's something that we'll see happening and becomes an important sort of theme in civic identity that we talked about earlier. Also, there are no surnames yet. This also happens much later, a surname or last name. So Leonardo da Vinci is actually the region where he's from. It's not technically his last name. So I just wanted to kind of make that clarification. So the first work by Leonardo that we're going to be looking at is the ever-famous Last Supper. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It was commissioned by Ludovico Sforza, who was the Duke of Milan. He had written Leonardo had written to the Duke advertising his services, not only as an artist, but also as a military strategist and inventor. And so he really, again, tried to sort of market himself as a Renaissance man. Leonardo had a sense that Florence was not going to be a good place for him to work in, and so this is why he solicited the Duke of Milan. His famous painting is located in the refectory of the Santa Maria del Grazie, which was a Dominican convent. So this is the room where the nuns would eat, and so obviously the Last Subject is a very, the Last Supper is obviously a very obvious or important subject matter, appropriate subject matter. Here's another slide just to give you a sense of the scale. During World War II, the church was bombed. In an effort to protect the painting, sandbags were placed in the front of the painting, and this saved the painting after the church was bombed. Here's a close-up. So this is a fresco painting. So remember, in Italy, they're doing fresco and tempera painting. Remember, in North Europe or the Northern Renaissance, they had perfected oil painting. So fresco painting is usually done on wet plaster. It had some disadvantages. Artists had to be able to work quickly, and this was not a good medium for Leonardo because he liked to work very slowly. He started experimenting with mixing oils and plaster, and this ultimately was a disaster because the painting started flaking off after only 10 years. In the 1980s, a restoration group preserved what it could of the painting. So these black squares or recesses that you see in the background would have originally had tapestry designs but have flaked off. So his experiment was not successful. So here's a comparison of two Last Supper scenes, Leonardo's, and hopefully you remember Andrea del Castagno. We talked about him during early Renaissance painting. He's not on your official list, but it's important that we had an earlier representation of the Last Supper to sort of compare and contrast how Leonardo changed it. So Leonardo really did deviate from the long tradition of how the Last Supper was depicted in the usual compositions. So here he places all the figures seated behind the table. So Judas, in earlier versions, was usually depicted on the opposite side of the table, away from the guests, in this earlier version. Leonardo also embraced, what? Can you think of the type of illusion or depth that Italians really loved? Hopefully you remembered linear one-point perspective. So you really do get a sense of this idea of a vantage point here, probably around Jesus's head, and then sort of receding, these sort of orthogonal or diagonal lines sort of receding to that vanishing point. And so he did use Alberti's codified theory of linear one-point perspective. And then here's a little diagram just to kind of remind you of that. So, remember, in North Europe, they weren't so concerned with realistic illusion. Often sometimes they tilt the composition up a little bit just so you could see everything because they really loved surface detail and wanted to sort of describe everything. But here, Italian artists really embraced linear one-point perspective and realistic illusionism. And again, here's another diagram just to remind you of how linear perspective works. So things in the foreground are usually larger than objects in the background. Illusion of three-dimensional realistic space. Realistic space, again, was a huge part and a huge convention and stylistic convention of the Italian Renaissance. And so here you can see, again, sort of applying this idea or this theory onto the actual composition. So the vanishing point was Christ's head. And note the coffered ceilings. And this sort of kind of creates or marks out the recession of depth as well. The black recesses also help give the illusion of deep space as well. that were supposed to have tapestries. Another stylistic feature related to composition was that Leonardo liked to organize his compositions by using pyramidal figures, which was basically the use of a triangle form deployed in depth, and it really emphasized the solidity and balance in the composition. So pyramidal, I know I'm probably not saying it right, but and you'll hear this term. We also talk about Raphael's work as well, who's our next artist. So pyramidal forms are really an important stylistic convention in high Renaissance painting. Another compositional device that he employed was parenthetical groups at either end of the composition. And so here you kind of see these groups on either end, and they almost sort of act like, sort of like a parentheses and sort of frame the composition. There's also hand gestures and eye glances that direct the viewer's eye through the composition. The viewer can easily distinguish 12 figures, so the composition is very balanced, okay, and very symmetrical. So you have 6 figures on each side. On each side, they're divided into 4 subgroups of 3. So again, this was done intentionally to really have that sort of balanced and symmetrical formal composition. So the Last Supper is not a typical depiction. There's some things that are changing. So Leonardo has pretty much eliminated the halos. I don't know if you remember those discs. In the early Renaissance, they had started to tilt them or foreshorten the halos, but now he's gotten rid of the halo completely. And instead, he uses the light from the window and the pediment above to sort of illuminate the figures. So he's actually using something scientific in this idea of light and reflection to sort of replace or symbolize this divine light of Jesus. And so also this use of light also helps with the illusion of depth as well. So you really do want to think of the window as almost like a halo, or replacing the halo. And you really do see how here it draws in this sort of bigger or this larger view, angle of view of the composition, how it really does highlight the figures and bring your attention to the center figure of Christ. So the scene is being depicted as the moment where Jesus proclaims, "One of you will betray me." And so, he says this, and we're able to see the reaction of his apostles. So we're going to kind of look in detail at the different groups and subgroups. So Leonardo wants us to see the individual responses and psychological reactions. The figures next to Christ on the right sort of look at him imploringly and like, "Oh my God, what? What do you mean? Who's gonna, are you kidding? Who's gonna betray you?" And sort of bewildered, and they're sort of discussing it. And also with this detail, you can really get a sense of how much of the pigment has flaked off. But, like we had talked about with the work of Giotto, when we really started talking about the early or proto-Renaissance, he's really using a lot of the same sort of compositional devices that Giotto had started to explore. And remember, Giotto was really one of the first, he was a transition artist from medieval to proto-Renaissance, but, he really ushered in this idea of modern painting and sort of paved the way for artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael. So on the left side, the figures, and it's kind of funny, they seem a bit more surprised and shocked at his words. And even here, the sort of figure holds his hands up like, "Oh my, what is he talking about?" So again, very, very interesting psychological reactions happening. It's also in this group that the figure of Judas is represented. So take a moment, look, and see if you can figure out who the figure of Judas is and how you were able to come to that assumption. So hopefully you remembered a term called physiognomy from the Greek physis, meaning nature, and Naaman, meaning judge or interpreter. And again, it's the assessment of a person's character or personality from his or her outer appearance, especially the face. And so we had seen this with the earlier version of the Last Supper that we looked at. And we'll kind of take a closer look and recap. So here's a detail of the figure of Judas. So, oops, I forgot to tell you. So this is the figure of Judas. So let's talk about maybe why you were able to identify him. A good way to discuss Judas is to kind of compare him also to the figure behind him, which is Peter. And this is actually a preliminary drawing that helps us isolate the two portraits for comparison. So Leonardo contrasted physical characteristics of facial features. So when we look at the figure of Judas, he has a hawk-like nose, his skin color is darker, he's the darkest one at the table, and in Renaissance time, this was a signifier of evil. Judas also had a protruding forehead and a jaw that resembles a beast. So, in contrast to the portrait of Peter, definitely, Peter is definitely depicted much more handsome with a sort of classic Roman nose. His skin is lighter. He definitely has a more classic, idealized face than Judas. So, Leonardo is considered an outlier. This is a good term for you, a vocabulary term for you to know. So, Outlier, which means he was very much ahead of his time. In this version of the Last Supper, he is uniting the earthly and divine. The earthly and divine. So what do you think by combining these two, what sort of statement is Leonardo making? So that's something I want you to think about and contemplate, and could be, something that you might be confronted with in a free response question or an essay. So just to give you some ideas, there's definitely a lack of obvious symbols of the divine, but we see it as a divine subject matter. So, obviously the absence of the halos is a big one to talk about. And this painting is really defining a moment of high Renaissance painting, where artists are finding a way to represent the eternal and perfect within the chaos of the human experience. And so this is why people are so drawn to this painting. And again, even though it's a religious subject matter, Leonardo is really emphasizing sort of our human selves and our place within the world as well, and sort of combining the two. This is a drawing or a cartoon done by Leonardo da Vinci. A cartoon is a full-scale prep drawing used to transfer the design to the intended surface. And what he would do, he had an interesting technique. He would poke a series of holes in the paper, outlining the subject, and then he would blow colored chalk to leave the imprint. Again, here's some pages from his from his sketchbook as well. So when we're looking at characteristics of Leonardo da Vinci's work, remember the pyramidal composition unifies the figure. So this sort of triangular form, makes it balanced and symmetrical. It also makes the figures more monumental. They appear large. They seem very dignified. And he's drawing from ancient classical sources. So remember, in Italy they had classical sources and paintings and statues to look at. And so this is why they were more in tune with these sort of classical ideas and sort of incorporating them into their work, as opposed to the North European artists who did not have that source material. And so, again, this idea of dignity of form, produced in light and shadow, is very sophisticated. There's a term that we should have learned earlier called chiaroscuro, which is, a difference between light and dark or shading. And when we look at the study for the cartoon, you can see the drawing evolves from a dark mass. So this is why I'm showing you this this study over here. And so this is sort of a drawing. that he did, a preliminary drawing that he did. And you really do see how dark and really how it almost sort of is radial. It sort of kind of comes out of this sort of darkness. The figures sort of morph, out of that sort of shadow. And so he really has a beautiful drawing technique. Leonardo started his drawings on toned ground, and then he worked his way from dark to light. So he would actually start with a dark mass and then sort of remove the different tones to sort of, and work backwards and sort of create highlights and almost sort of drawing or erasing and, removing the darker tones to reveal lighter tones. And so this is important because his technique created really velvety shadows. And Leonardo does not think in terms of line, so he's not a linear artist. You really look closely at this work, and it's really hard to discern a line. All of this is really achieved by this sort of contrast of light and dark. Here's a better close-up for you to look at. So Leonardo's technique from working dark to light created smoky-like edges, and this was coined sfumato. Sfumato, S-F-U-M-A-T-O. So no lines, but more like undefined edges that are completed by the viewer's eye. And so this was a technique and definitely a term, sfumato, that you need to really be associating with the style of Leonardo. Here's another page, and this should be familiar. I showed this page from Leonardo's sketchbook when I was comparing and contrasting his work with sort of the Leonardo of North Europe, Dura, the father of printmaking. Leonardo's drawing seems to emerge out of a central core, very similar to the one of his notebook drawing of a plant. So again, that sort of mass of this sort of dark, and then the form sort of coming out and emerging from this core of darkness. And this really relates back to how he tried to hypothesize how universal principles worked in the human body. So he was very much interested in searching for universal principles that governed organic life. So please get that term or that sentence in your head, because that's a very important characteristic of his work. Because you have a family. Here's another detail where you can really get a sense of that sfumato technique and sort of those sort of undefined edges from light to dark. So I'm going to end, this is going to be the first part of this segment. I will pick up in our second segment, part 2 of the High Renaissance, with the artist Raphael. So stay tuned.